So as I mentioned, I want to use the this class as a form of final thoughts on free will. We're going to be answering another question related to free will, but I guess the overarching question is tonight is life's biggest questions. The overarching question for tonight is really, why is it that we have been spending so much time talking about free will? Well, I think this is the 8th class. There was an 8-part series, 7-part series on free will, and this is going to be the last in that series. Next week's topic, by the way, is going to be the question of why did God create the world? That might be a two-part class. Why did God create the world? But this long series, a relatively long series, mini series on free will, what was the purpose of it? Why is it that it is so important, so critical? Really going back to an introduction to the whole concept of life's biggest questions that we have been learning in the last 6 months or so, is 5 months, is the Chazon Ish, who we had brought down as writing that the reason why one should study topics like this is that it's supposed to engage the human creativity and human curiosity that one should have and always have with them in all aspects of life, that these are things we should be curious about, and that the more curious we are about it, it's supposed to have an effect on us in our relationship with God. Free will, where does that fall? How is that the case? Why is free will so important? But before we get to answering that question, there was still one more question I wanted to get to that we are not going to devote an entire class to, but nevertheless, an interesting question in and of itself related to free will. And that is the role of bashert. I don't know if everyone here is familiar with the term bashert. Fate, usually the term bashert is used in the context of a shidduch, a match. A match is bashert, and you are looking for your bashert. When two people get engaged, the shidduch was bashert, that there was fate, there was mazel in the shidduch. We wish mazel tov, recognizing that Hashem had a clear hand in bringing this couple together. What is this role of bashert, the fate that Hashem brought the two people together? And basically that Yiddish terminology basically is saying that one does not have free will when it comes to choosing a mate. Basically, it sounds like that one really doesn't have free will, that it's almost like it's preordained who you are going to marry. And there are Gemaras that indicate such a thing. I'm going to share my screen here. There's really these fascinating Gemaras. The Gemara, let's see if I'm able to share my screen. Hold on, let's see. Let's see if I'm able to share my screen. Not working, hold on. Nope, not working. Okay, I'm using a different computer tonight, so it was not prepared for me to share my screen. So I'll read you the Gemaras outside. The Gemara, first in Masechta Sota, is dealing with the following. The Gemara is quoting from the Mishnah that says that quoting from the Brisa, that shidduchim, that making matches for Hashem are something that are miraculous. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabba bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, the kashan lezivugin kekriyas yamsuf, that it is just as difficult for God to make pairs as it was for him to split the sea. Now, obviously, for God, it is not difficult for him to do anything. So what the Gemara really means is that it is just as great of a miracle of bringing two people together as it is for him to split the sea. Ask the Gemara, Ini, Is it really the case that God is the one in charge of bringing the couples together? V'amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rav that Arbayim Yom Kodem Mitziras Havlad, that 40 days before a child is even conceived, meaning their soul has already come into the celestial worlds, but the fetus is yet to be formed. So then Baskol Yotzas Omeres, that there is a heavenly voice that issues forth and says, Bas Ploni Leploni, the daughter of so and so, is ordained to be married to so and so, and Bas Ploni Leploni, and the house of Ploni is going to make a shidduch with the house of Ploni, meaning that there is a predestined marriage that is going to be taking place. Sada Ploni Leploni, that this field is going to go to this person, meaning to say that in the form of dowries and the like, meaning that these are already preordained. So says the Gemara, that is true, that ha bezivo grishon, it's true with regard to your first marriage, that if a person, the first time they get married, that is something that is completely preordained from God. However, ha bezivo gsheni, however, when it comes to your second marriage, that is something that is dependent on a person's merits, and it's something that they seem to have complete control over. What does the Gemara seem to be indicating? The Gemara seems to be indicating that God is really the one who makes the matches, that it's not up to the person, meaning to say that the concept of cold feet is not really a thing. It's not up to you, that you are not really the one who is making that call as to who you are going to marry, which is just seems odd. It just seems off, because I mean, at least the way I recall it all coming together for myself was that, yes, there were obviously, you can see the hand of God in a shidduch coming together, in two people meeting, but ultimately whether or not the person is going to pop the question of, will you marry me, and ask the parents for permission, and go to the chuppah, and walk to the chuppah, and give the ring under the chuppah, and go to the yichud room. These are things that obviously you are using your free will to make decisions about. So why is the Gemara saying then that presumably no, that seems that no, you do not really have free will in this particular area. In fact, the Gemara takes this a step further. It compounds, it doubles down on this suggestion, on this notion that we do not have free will when it comes to our own marriages. The Gemara doubles down on this in a Gemara Masechta Moed Katan. The Gemara Masechta Moed Katan on Daf Yud Ches is all of the laws of Chol HaMoed. That in the laws of Chol HaMoed, the Gemara is talking about how one is able to do the first part of marriage. I mean, you're not able to have Sheva Brachos, you're not able to have the full-fledged wedding on Chol HaMoed over Yantiv, but you can get engaged, you can get halachically engaged on Chol HaMoed. Why is it that one is able to? Says the Gemara, because Shmuel says, Shema Yaktimenu Acher, because perhaps someone else is going to come along and chap her up. Someone else is going to come along and chop her up. Someone else is going to marry her. Ask the Gemara. No, they won't. We just learned before that if she's destined to be married to you, don't say, "Oh, I have to wait till after Yontiv to get engaged because I can't wait till after Yontiv to get engaged because I'm concerned that if I wait till after Yontiv, someone else is going to chop her up and is going to get engaged to her and then is going to marry her." You shouldn't be concerned about such a thing. Why? Because if that actually ends up happening, that means that you are not the one that was ordained to be married to her by God. So ask the Gemara, so then why would we allow someone to get engaged on Yontiv? If there's no real concern about someone else stealing your potential wife, because it clearly wasn't your potential wife if someone else was able to get engaged to her. Ask the Gemara, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, B'chol Yom V'Yom Bas Kol Yotzos V'Omeros, that there is a heavenly voice that comes out every single day and says that this person is supposed to marry that person. So says the Gemara, El Hashem Yaktimenu Acher Berachamin. Hold on 1 second. That perhaps answers the Talmud that this concept of that it's preordained is not taking into account prayer, tefillah. Let's say there are two individuals that were destined by God to get married, and then someone else has their eye on a certain girl, loves her, love at first sight. But she was already preordained to marry someone else. But then this fellow prays and prays and prays and prays and prays. Hashem could change his mind and decide, you know what? The second fellow B, Shimon, not Reuven, is now the one who is going to marry Leah. So that says the Gemara is also problematic. Why? Because when something is already preordained by God, we do not pray, says the Gemara, to change such a thing. Such a thing, we do not pray to change such matters. So the Gemara then gets into, so then why is it that one is allowed to get engaged on Yantiv? And we're not going to get into that right now. But what comes out from this Gemara is that we are taking this concept so to the nth degree that not only do we assume that every single marriage is preordained, that you do not seem to have free will in that regard, but number two is that if you like a girl, you're not supposed to pray you're going to marry her, because it's already decided who it is that you're going to marry. Very, very odd, very, very strange, because it seems to be against what our feeling is. Remember, Rav Sadia Gaon says that's one of the proofs of free will, is this sense of we feel free. We feel that we do have agency over our decision-making process. So the Chassam Sofer Zatzal, Rabbi Moshe Schreiber of 18th century Oberlander region, Hungary, was the was really the chief rabbi of that whole region, and his center was in Pressburg. So the Chassam Sofer, he answers this issue by first basing himself off of a Rambam. The Rambam, in his responsa, Maimonides, 1138 to 1204, Baruch Atan, the Rambam gives us a guiding principle when it comes to study of Talmud and Tanaic and Amoraic literature. When we're studying our medieval texts, the Rambam says, we need to be very careful not falling into the trap of reading these texts superficially. By the way, this is a common pitfall that a lot of yeshiva students in the early stages of their learning fall into, that they read statements of Chazal, of our holy sages, on a superficial level. And then because of the fact that they doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to them, because of the fact that they read it in a superficial fashion, it turns them off from learning. But if you become sensitized to reading these texts in a not superficial fashion, and rather looking at the way that the commentaries deal with what the intention behind the sages' comments are, you actually find that there's a lot of depth contained within them. So the Rambam presents this methodology in the study of Talmud, and specifically Aggadic sources in the Talmud, in a very, very clear way. He writes the following. He says, Kach roi lemishahu mevin, that if a person wants to understand something well, v'libo nachon lito derech ha'emes, and really they are open to understanding the truth and finding the path of truth. Shiasim inyan zeh, they should really put into their heart the following methodology, that hamifurash batorah ikar, all of the principles that are clearly defined by the Torah, the mitzvot, clear statements from Chazal, the halacha. These are things that you need to take seriously, that you read them and you take them at face value. However, for Yesod Shalo Yaharus Binyan, that however a person should not, that a person should not take the statements of our rabbis and v'yitur hatekua asher lo tamut v'kshiyimtza pasuk medivrei hanavim or davar medivrei chazal, that when you find something that either from the prophets or from our rabbis cholik al ikar zeh, that contradict our basic fundamental beliefs, for example, the one we just encountered, how it seems like there is a statement from our rabbis that contradicts the entire concept of free will with regard to basheret, with regard to making shidduchim, matchmaking, v'soter inyan zeh, and it completely contradicts the entire fundamental concept that one is already working with. Yidrosh v'vakesh ba'ayin libo. A person really cannot take that at face value. They should not just read it superficially. Rather, they need to investigate the matter. Until they can understand what it is that the prophet or the sage had said, until that which the sage or the rabbi taught sticks in line with the basic fundamental principles of the Torah, hare muta, that is going to be much better for you. You're going to understand Torah a lot better that way. Ve'im lav, yomer divrei hanavi hazeh, or divrei chacham zeh, ze'eno yodea otam. Rather, a person is going to come to the conclusion that this thing doesn't make any sense. And then that opens up a Pandora box of a person thinking that really there's no validity to anything that the prophets or the sages had said. And therefore, it's important, rather, says the Rambam, that when you come to a passage like this, cannot read it superficially. Rather, you have to keep working on it and working on it and working on it until you can see how this fits in to the greater fundamental principle that is already established. So let's fit it in, says the Chassam Sofer, to our particular situation. Our particular situation is we know that we have a general principle of free will. In fact, it is perhaps the most fundamental of all of the principles of the Torah. We said from the Abarbanel, that's why the Rambam didn't even include it on his list of the 13 fundamental principles of Judaism, because it's what all the fundamental principles of Judaism are even based on, is this concept of free will. It's what defines man. Free will is basic Judaism 101. So then if that's the case, so then this comment that our rabbis are making, and then doubling down on it in another place in the Talmud, saying that you can't even pray to marry a certain woman because it's already preordained by God, seeming to say that one does not have free will when it comes to choosing their spouse. You cannot take that so superficially. You can't take that so literally. You have to put it back into the framework, says the Rambam, of the general concept of free will. So how do you do that? The Chassam Sofer takes care of it for us. The Chassam Sofer writes the following. He says, Aval davar hatalui bebechiras v'chevetz ha'adam. Rather, of course, when it comes to picking your spouse, of course, it's dependent completely on your choice and what a person wants. God is not going to change a person's mind. If a person doesn't want to marry this girl, no one's going to force him to. God is not going to hold a gun to your head and force you to stand under the chuppah. It's not like every single wedding in Judaism is a shotgun wedding. It's not the way it works. Every single person makes a decision who it is that they are going to marry. Rather, this whole concept that there's a heavenly voice that calls out, this person's going to marry this person 40 days before even the fetus is formed. That's a very Kabbalistic concept, says the Chassam Sofer. Not something that is telling you that you do not have free will. Rather, it's to say that, of course, you choose who you're going to marry. And what that means that God had already made some sort of a declaration that these two people were going to get married even before they were fully formed from an embryo to a full fetus into a child is something that is perhaps beyond human comprehension exactly what that means. And something quite Kabbalistic, he writes. Basically, the Chassam Sofer notes that there's many factors that contribute to something as significant as finding a spouse. And among them are divine pronouncement, but of course, human free choice plays a clear role. This is, I think, very similar. If we were going to maybe give a more simplified, or at least more understandable explanation, I think it would be something a little bit more similar to what we were talking about with regards to Rav Moshe Feinstein. Remember, Rav Moshe said that how is it that we can pray for God to accept our teshuvah? We every single day, 3 times a day in our Shemona Esrei, we ask God to accept our teshuvah. And Rav Moshe writes that, yes, of course, you can't, we're not saying, God, make me do teshuvah. That's, of course, only up to me. It's my free choice whether or not I'm going to better myself. But what we can ask God is, make it a little bit easier for me in the sense that take away some of the roadblocks that are preventing me from getting back on the path of connection to you. Help me in removing some of the passions and desires that are more naturally inbred that you have created within me, that pull me in the direction toward sin. That's what we're asking God. And then if we do that, it's going to make teshuvah a much simpler process. I think this is something similar in that it's not that a person is forced to marry so-and-so, but rather when 2 people meet, that's something heavenly. That's something that is amazing, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had pulled so many strings for the 2 of you to cross paths, and that there is something physiological that is attracting the 2 of you to one another. And the fact that you have chemistry, and you are the other puzzle piece to that person. You fit together. It works. Whether or not to actually make the decision to get married, completely up to you. That's the way that I would present this the Chassam Sofer over here. Moving on now to the general conclusion to the topic of free will. And of course, this was another, the first half of this class was a good opportunity to review some of the major concepts of free will with a good case study in 2 people getting married, and that really a person does have complete agency over their actions. We mentioned from Sadi going the 4 different proofs of how a person, how we know that people have free will. And of course, it's one of the basic principles of the Torah. And it really gets to a very philosophical question, which is, who is the real me? You know, when a person is in a mode of teshuvah, so then one could, after inspirational moments or after these laser-focused times of the year that we are so focused on teshuvah, that a person could think back and say that you know, I was putting on a show. That wasn't the real me. I fell back into my old habits very, very quickly, and I was back to sinning. So who is the real me? Is the real me the person that's standing by Ne'ilah on Yom Kippur without even an inkling of a desire to do wrong? Or is the real me the one that behind closed doors and in the depths of my mind and heart struggle with certain things, and that's really the real me, is the one that messes up? So who is the real me? So this is a question that is posed by the Maharal. The Maharal of Prague, who probably since the Ramban, Nachmanides, probably the greatest of all Jewish philosophers, where he basically puts it into the context of New Year's resolutions, right? Rosh Hashanah, or in the secular world, January 1st. So many people have New Year's resolutions. We know that there are studies that show that just as many people who keep New Year's resolutions are basically just as many people who who fail to follow through with them past mid-February, and people just fall back into their old habits. Rosh Hashanah is strong. You feel so connected. The sound of the shofar, Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, Yom Kippur, and then in fact even the tour recognizes that Sukkot comes along and people start falling back into their old ways. He says that's why Sukkot is referred to as Bayom HaRishon, the first day. And the Torah quotes from the Medrash that it's Rishon Hu L'Cheshbon Avonos. It's the first day that people start sinning again. After Rosh Hashanah, 15 days later, 2 weeks later, a person starts falling back into their old habits. So then who was the real me? Was the real me the one standing on Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, the one who made all of those Kabbalos, all of those New Year's resolutions? Or is the real me the one that fell back into his old habits 2 weeks later? So the Maharal answers this question by putting it into the context of how do we understand the concept of teshuvah. And the Maharal basically writes the following. He says that really people want to be good. People want to be good. People want to do the right thing. So then why don't they succeed? If that's what we really want, if we really do want to be good, why don't we succeed? Why is it that 2 weeks after Rosh Hashanah, we're already starting to fall back into our old habits? So he says, because we become overtaken with desire, emotion, passion, but the Maharal argues that this is really the basis for teshuvah. Because when a person does teshuvah, what it is that they're telling God that at that time when I sinned, I was just overtaken with the passions, desires, and emotions that clouded my decision-making. And that's what caused me to sin. But that wasn't the real me. It wasn't me that made that decision. And therefore, God gives you the allowance of teshuvah because he believes you and says, I believe you. It was just your passions, your emotions, your desires, what is referred to by Chazal, your Yetzer Hara got the better of you. And therefore, I'm going to give you another chance because I know that is not who you really are. Teshuvah, therefore, in essence, is about defining who I really am. But what if a person didn't sin with their emotions or their passions or their desires? What if a person sinned with their intellect? Meaning they knew well and good exactly what they were doing. They made a conscious decision to do evil, not to give in to human, baseless, just animalistic desire, but they had a conscious decision. I am going to do evil. Says the Maharal, in such a scenario, God can't provide you the allowance of teshuvah. Why? Because that means that's who you really are. Basically, the Maharal says that who you really are is up to you. That's where free will lies. Free will lies or rather, who you really are is really your choice. It's up to you. That teshuvah is impossible if a person had sinned due to an intellectual conclusion, because that's you saying that's who I really am. But if a person sins or because they were overtaken with their desire, their emotions, and it's not that they were fully aware of the gravity of what they were doing, so then that's not evil. That's just a person making a mistake, and people make mistakes. So then basically, to answer the question, who's the real me? So the real me is the one who desires, to do, the real me, says the Maharal, is something that we can choose. The answer is that we choose, that the agent of choice is what defines who we are. That's an amazing comment of the Maharal. And we know that the Rambam writes that this is the most basic fundamental belief that we have is free will, is this ability to choose. And basically the Maharal saying that this is a defining quality of a person. It's defining who you are. And the Rambam wrote, if you recall, he said that Iker Gadol Hu Vuhu Amud HaTorah VaMitzvah. It is the most fundamental of all of our beliefs, free will, and it is the foundation of the entire Torah and mitzvah. So that would be a reason in it of itself, enough of a reason in and of itself for us to have spent the last 8 weeks talking about free will. But then I fell upon recently an incredible comment from Rav Dessler. That Rav Dessler says it's not only that this is just a fundamental concept that, as the Maharal wrote, helps define or really defines who a person is what you do with your free will and whether or not you are just making decisions based off passions or desires or actually intellect. And if your intellect is an evil one, so then that is what defines a person as evil. And where that means that 99.9% of people are actually good people that just make mistakes. So it's more than that. But Rav Dessler writes that free will is really the grandeur of all of mankind. It's perhaps the most important thing for us to constantly remind ourselves of is the fact that I have free will and I am the agent of my decisions. And Rav Dessler adds one more challenge to free will, in that it's not an external challenge. It's not a challenge of Sam Harris. It's not a challenge of whether or not you can prove free will. He says, really the main challenge based on this Maharal is self-doubt. Whether or not you believe you actually are the agent of your decisions. Whether or not you really can make choices. That if you believe that, so then you can be destined for greatness. But on the other hand, if you have self-doubt, if you do not believe that you can make the right decisions, so then you're leading down a pathway towards hopelessness. And he writes in the Michtav Meliyahu, Rav Dessler writes, "Bechira zu taluya bo legamri." That freedom is entirely in a person's hands. Ve'ein siba shetisovev ota. Elahu ba'atzmo hasiba harishon Allah. There is nothing that is going to force a person to do one thing or another. You have complete control in your hands. V'zeh baduk u'menusa la'adam asher gabar al yitzro afilu rak pam achas. And this is tested and confirmed to anyone who's overcome his desires even just one time. Shemargish barur bilivavo, shu atzmo mischarachek min hadimyon. That he has completely recognized that I have control over my actions. A person who actually has had success with their free will, as Maharal said, help define who they are in a positive light. That if a person really had success, and they accomplished something, they jumped that hurdle. Like we learned last week from Rav Dessler, how he compared it to like enemy lines, that you pushed the enemy line further back, meaning you have actually gained territory over your Yetzer Hara, that your Yetzer Hatov, your goodness, has gained more ground, and you've actually accomplished a significant amount in your self-growth and character growth, and you can see your development. So then you know without question that free will exists. That really the major threat to free will is your own self-doubt. Whether or not I have free will, I don't know. I keep making the same mistakes over and over again. Who's the real me? I 2 weeks after Rosh Hashanah, I'm back to my old ways. No, then that's when it's going to lead a person down to hopelessness. But if a person after 2 weeks after Rosh Hashanah sees themselves starting to fall back in their old ways and catches themselves and says, you know what? I actually have control over this. I have free will. It can get a person right back on the path. That's why this is such an important topic to learn, because it's a defining topic. It can propel a person into greatness. He continues and he writes, but if a person has never actually conquered their desires, their passions, their emotions, their entire life, they can't even begin to comprehend the whole concept of free will at all. Because his experience tells him that every time he wished to do something wrong, so then every time he wanted to do something wrong, he just did it. And he didn't think about it more than that, beyond that. Therefore, it's impossible for him to understand free will. And he thinks that all of my actions are based on external factors, and it's not based on my own capabilities from within. Rav Yitzchak Hutner Zatzal, the great Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivas Chaim Berlin in New York. Rav Yitzchak Hutner was one of the greatest Rosh Yeshiva in America in the 60s. Rav Hutner Zatzal, he was very, very close to the Rabbi Soloveitchik. Rav Hutner Zatzal writes in one of his letters to one of his students, he writes that a person needs to make sure that they are cognizant of this all the time, especially in our day and age, where more and more there's more and more contemporary weakening of free will through different thinkers and authors and new age philosophers and psychologists and neuroscientists and biologists and everybody's coming at and attacking it from all sides. A person needs to keep reminding themselves that no, if you've done it before, you know it's there, you know it's true, that there's no such thing as my actions are defined for me. That the real me is up to me. I can make that choice. I see myself slipping back. No. I'm not going to let it happen. I'm going to get right back on the horse. A person needs to constantly reflect on this and keep battling the outside perspectives. He writes the following. He says that the more humans are perceived as nothing more than sophisticated animals, enslaved to their instincts and biases, and unable to triumph over their innate desires, the less room there is for free will. But on the other hand, he writes, on the other hand, when we recognize that we are more than the blood, bones, and sinews that make up our physical bodies, when we recognize the true greatness of man, free will becomes compelling. Free will becomes the crown of human grandeur. It helps define the greatness of man. Remember, we had learned the Rambam, who one could have read this Rambam, probably the first dozen times I read this Rambam, I took it as an exaggeration, but the Rambam is not exaggerating here. Remember, the Rambam wrote that one cannot believe that there's anything that forces someone to do one thing or over another thing, that it's completely up to you. Everybody has free choice. You're agents over your own actions. And then he writes, Ela kol adam ra'ui lo. Every person has the capacity, the ability, the capability, lihiyos tzaddik k'Moshe Rabbeinu, to be a tzaddik, to be righteous, like Moshe Rabbeinu, to be just as great as Moshe. The Rambam is not exaggerating here. He's giving us a literal definition of what free will can accomplish. Like Rav Hutner is saying, that if a person truly sees them as having the ability to overcome their own passions, desires, and emotions, if they truly believe it, and even if they slip a little bit, they come right back to that battle, to that battleground like Rav Dessler described, you could achieve true greatness. This Rav Hutner was describing is the part of the problem of today, he's writing basically that there's a direct correlation in the weakening belief of free will to the lack of belief in the greatness that man can achieve. That there's this notion today that, so a lot of people refer to it as the art scroll problem. That you read these art scroll biographies and you think that they came out of the womb knowing Shas Bavli Yerushalmi and the greatest tzaddikim that ever lived from the time that they were 6 months old. And for some of them, it actually is not that far off of an exaggeration. I mean, I heard secondhand accounts of the Brisker Rav that by the time he was 7 years old was already giving chidushim in Masechta Krisos. Okay, fine. The Brisker Rav had incredible intellect. Okay, great. He had incredible intellect. But you know what? The Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvidu Berlin, who, in my opinion, was the most influential Jew of the last 200 years. The most influential Jew of the last 200 years. The Netziv, no one thought he was going to achieve greatness. As a young child, no one thought he was going to achieve greatness. It wasn't until he applied himself that he made a decision. He was not referred to as a Gaon, as a genius, as an Eloi, as someone that from the time he was 10 years old knew Shas. Not at all, not even the slice. In fact, it wasn't until he was a student in Volozhin in his early 20s, which back then was very late in the game, did people start to recognize just how great he actually was. Because he applied himself. He made a decision that I am not going to let my Yetzer Hara get the best of me. I'm not going to let myself think, you know what, God didn't create me with great intellect, and therefore, I'll let the Brisker Ravs of the world, I'll let the Vilna Gaons of the world, I'll let the Reb Chaim Volozhiners of the world be the Gedolim, and I'll be a shoemaker. No. He made a decision. He defined who he really was based on his own free will, and he achieved greatness. This is something that we all can do. The Rambam tells us, not me. I'm just reading a Rambam. This is something that we all have the ability to do. We have the ability to become as great as Rav Elyashiv and Rebbetzin Kanievsky. There's no doubt. There's no doubt. And this is not only in the area of what we refer to as Ben Adam L'Makom, as relationship between you and God and achieving greatness in Torah and Mitzvah, but this is also in Ben Adam L'Chavero as well, of course, in the way that we treat other people, the sensitivity to other people. We can become Gedolim in Ben Adam L'Chavero in the way we treat other people, like Rav Elyashiv and Rebbetzin Kanievsky. I'll just share with you one story about Rav Elyashiv and his Ben Adam L'Chavero and achieving greatness in this area. There is a woman who came to meet with Rav Elyashiv because unfortunately, she her daughter was getting mixed up in the wrong crowds and was really just having a bad influence on her siblings, was not keeping to the standard of the family in terms of religious life, and it was becoming she was being rebellious, and it was becoming a very toxic situation in the home, to the point that she felt that, similar to Sarah Imenu and what the decision she had to make with Yishmael and kicking him out of the home because it was too risky for Yitzchak to have Yishmael around. She felt that this was the situation, that this one child would have such a horrible influence on the 7 other siblings. To save the other 7, maybe we have to kick this child out of the house. We have to send her away. Maybe that's the only option. To save the other 7, Sacrifice one. But how could you sacrifice your own child? This was the question that was posed to Rabbi Yashiv. Rabbi Yashiv, without missing a beat, said to her, do you have other family in Yerushalayim and in other parts of Israel? She said, yeah, I have a sister that lives there. My parents live there. I have aunts and uncles and cousins. And he said, okay, you're going to send her 7 siblings to live and dorm with other family members, and you're going to devote all of your time to this child. Like that level of sensitivity and thinking, like who would expect that answer? Who would expect that answer? The answer would be either keep her around or get rid of her. But when you've worked on yourself so much in perfection of what a human can achieve, in the way that you treat others, the sensitivity towards others, and in your own personal relationship with God, so then you're able to think like that. You're able to think like, no, there's a solution to take care of everybody here. That no one needs to be sacrificed. Everyone can be taken care of. We shouldn't kid ourselves that that this is in the exclusive domain of great rabbis and great rebbitzins and people like Moshe Rabbeinu, Rabbi Akiva, the Ramban, and the Chassam Sofer. This is for us. This is why learning about free will is so important. Because when you know it to be true and you know that it's something that you have power over, it is the most empowering thing. It is the most empowering thing to achieve greatness. Okay, we will stop here for now. Next week, we'll take on a small topic. Why did God create the world? Why did God create the world? All right, we'll stop here for now.